Deaf interpreters are changing the way sign language interpreting works. Interpreting profession is now facing a shift in its structure. Much research is being done about what is causing this. ASL is being shown new ideas and new perspectives that are open for everyone. Deaf interpreters are involved in the profession more now than ever. And that will shift the paradigm. Okay. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about history of interpreting. Now, deaf interpreters were not always called deaf interpreters, but let's see where we can find the first one. Deaf interpreters have taken care of translations and making sure information is understood by everyone. If another person needed help writing a letter, up until now, that has been what deaf interpreters have been. I'm going to share with you a little bit about my experience. Growing up, I went to an oral school. All of my family was hearing. And when I was young, if the other deaf students didn't understand, they would come to me and ask me, and we would figure out how to communicate in some form of gestures and mouthing until they understood. And I was beat with a ruler for this. It was a small thing, but they just wanted to have access to communication. And then when I was in high school, I was mainstream, meaning I was put into a public high school when I was the only deaf person there. But on the weekends, all the deaf students that were my age in the area would come to my house. And they would ask me for help with their homework. And I would go through and explain and help them. People continued doing this kind of thing with coming up to me and asking me for help to understand throughout my life. And these experiences were something that I felt like I was required to do. It's not something I ever wanted to fight against. It was my obligation to give back to the community this way. So when my husband and I finally got our house, this was before the time where there was doorbell things that would make it so that the lights would flash. The police would come to my house and they would knock, and my hearing shields would get up and let us know the police were here. And the police would ask for one of us to go with them to help a community member. And me and my husband would decide between of us which one of us would go and figure out what was happening. Now, you have to understand that I've been acting as an interpreter for many years, but never as a professional CDI. Again and again, I was put in these situations where I had to act as an interpreter. I didn't have schooling. This was just what I did. Now, as we can see, that deaf interpreters are becoming more prevalent. There's a few programs popping up here and there. Deaf interpreters is just expanding quite a bit nowadays. But there's no research on how deaf interpreters go about their work. Hearing interpreters have always hearing interpreters have always been in charge of the way the field has shifted. There's always had to be a hearing interpreter. But hearing interpreters have to follow the deaf interpreter. how this hearing interpreters have always been the ones in control of how to go about interpreting and processing the hearing field. Whether it was the conduit method or the interprofessional method, it was hearing interpreters that decided what was the right way to go. But this isn't how it works with other languages interpreting. For a long time, historically, interpreters have been making the decisions about hearing interpreters have been making decisions about the interpreting field. Whether it's the conduit method, however they go about it, they're the ones who have made the decisions up until now. Many of us in the deaf community have a different standard of what it means to be an interpreter, what it means to be a good interpreter. But we have never been given a seat at the table. Now, in the interpreting profession for the past 60 years, interpreters have been the only ones controlling what has happened. Hearing interpreters. If you look at different spoken languages interpreting, you see that the two languages worked together to figure out the best way. While with the hearing profession, interpreters, it's different. Both languages don't have a seat at the table. Up until now, deaf individuals have had an idea of what interpreters is, and that's just how it's been up until now. But now that deaf interpreters have showed up to the picture, things are shifting. Deaf people finally have a seat at the table. But this is taking hearing interpreters time to adjust. If an hearing interpreter's never had to deal with a deaf person not being their client before, it's just a shift in flux in the situation that they're not ready for. Making sure that everything is clear in communication is a struggle. Interpreters usually going to only with two people, one to the other person and then back together. Now they have to go through another person to make the communication happen. And some hearing interpreters struggle with this. Deaf people up until now have claimed the deaf community as their own, and that interpreters don't have a right to change it. So, how do we confront this situation and language and culture? It's how do I. So, during work, it is something that we have to work on. It's normal for interpreting to be simultaneous, where the interpreter is watching what's happening and just keeps going and doesn't stop. But we have to move away from that. It has to be turn taking, so that everything is understood. This is just how it has to be. It's time. What time is it? Oh, okay, good. Now I want to discuss research a little bit. Europe, spoken language interpreting is very prevalent. French, Spanish, Which is your mother tongue? Which is your mother tongue? What is your first language? Is it Spanish? And what's your mother tongue? Is it French? So they take their interpretations and they mask the Spanish language and culture for that. It's important that deaf consumers know about this. Now, as we shift the use of interpreters and the interpreting field, there are things that have to happen. Some interpreters just flow real well with the change, but there are many interpreters that are resisting it. We try to get them to work with us, but they don't always. That those interpreters feel attacked, feel like they're not good enough, that we're looking down on them. They have to acknowledge that the deaf interpreters are skilled, and we understand that the hearing interpreter is skilled with English. For us deaf people, our experiences and our feelings in our gut instinct is different than the hearing interpreters. How we see things and understand things is different than how hearing people do. Culture mediation has to match the deaf culture. It's important to make sure that the empowerment is still there between a deaf person and a hearing person. We can't forget who they are. Now, I know that there's a few deaf interpreters here in the crowd. Yesterday meeting, there was a bunch of you. So, I know that the group has been going to different meetings and getting involved in research studies for interpreting and language studies and all these things that are important to our field. I want to know if you noticed the shift that is taking place. Throughout the interpreting process, people don't always realize, oh, you're going to be an interpreter? Yes, deaf people can be interpreters. It's a collaboration between us. It has to happen. Up until now, deaf people have had the communication power. We tried to get comfortable with it. We have been our own interpreters to make sure that communication is happening. So I'm going to talk about community-based interpreting and mainstream interpreting and how these two things compare to each other. Mainstream is more focused on speed. While community interpreting is focused on communication and understanding and the culture and identity that is all involved in the language and socialization. That's the main difference. We know that mainstream interpreting has a place in the system, but we want to change and establish more community interpreting. It's time. It is time to reclaim the deaf interpreting norm. Up until now, we've been lending it out, but we need to reclaim it for our profession. Honestly, deaf interpreters, the amount of deaf interpreters is expanding right now. Between translation and interpreting, there are many people that are deaf interpreters. But they are pushed out to the sides. We have to bring them back in. It's important that we don't push them to the side and we welcome them. That's what will give us the strength to continue in this field. It's very important that we take back our deaf interpreting norm. Hearing and deaf people must collaborate and work together to figure out the best solution and work together as a team. Deaf and hearing, both. It's important in courtroom, in health, in practice, in education, in performance. It's working together is important in all fields. I work with a lot of that importance in courtrooms. In court situations, they tend to use interpreting teams. In that situation, what is important is not speed. We can't follow here in court culture where they can't stand silences and they can't stand being slow. We have to work with communication as the priority. We will increase our collaboration between deaf and hearing interpreters. I want to leave you with one important thing. Deaf communication and socialization is very important that we share thoughts and ideas with each other and we communicate these ideas. For hearing, it's all about process and speed. If you only worry about that and you're making sure understanding's happening, it is important. Making sure that understanding is the most important. How far behind are hearing interpreters? Deaf and hearing interpreters must stand on the same field and work together to translate together, making sure everyone understands as the process goes through. That's what will make this successful. Thank you all so much for your time today.